Hey, everybody. A question that I get often is when it comes to interval training. We start diving into someone's training and they ask, well, how long should the interval be? How long should the rest be? How many intervals should I be doing? And I'm going to shed some light on that today. So we use muscle oxygen saturation monitors in a lot of the testing that we do, but that's only a small part of it. When it comes to using SMO2 monitors, in training, that's where they really show the true potential on how we can really help someone train optimally. So, when it comes to the landscape of doing interval training, most of the time, what we've done in the past, and honestly, you've probably done this too, has just been to just train for a certain given time, regardless of what's going on. So, we kind of pick amount of time that we're going to work for, pick amount of time that we're going to rest for, and the number of intervals. And we try to correlate what we know that makes sense for the application that we're looking for. But how do we really know that's really going to be enough, too much? Is it really optimal for that athlete? And we have to consider, especially interval training, think of it kind of like taking a medication, where are we taking enough of a dose to have the effect that we're looking for, or are we really taking too much? And we're really causing that athlete to not really being able to develop the way that we're looking for as well. Now, on either end of those spectrum, I think it's really valuable to try to find that optimal amount. And every athlete's going to be different in this regard. So when we're thinking, especially about the gone too far, so the maximum dose, now, that's going to have cascading effects to the athlete where injury rates will rise. They won't have the same ability to recover. They may not be able to repeat that same performance again throughout the week if needed. The rest of their training might suffer. And in terms of conditioning for team sports in the off season, like there's only so much energy to go around. And this is where it's so frustrating, where people just get into programs and they think that just getting the hell beat out of them, them being tired is them developing. And that's so far from the truth. We have to try to get enough of a response where the athlete's going to develop and we can see that development. And then the other part of it is to not just beat them into the ground, because there's better ways. And again, there's only so much energy to go around, and there's a lot of things that athletes have to work on in the off season for them to really develop. Excuse me. So what we're going to go through today is an athlete doing an interval on a bike. And the whole goal for this, we're going to start to break that down a little bit. So what I think is super important is to, number one, kind of get athletes to understand what and why they're doing it. So for this athlete's case, what we're looking here is this SMO2. This is the muscle oxygen saturation. So we use a Moxy monitor to see what the oxygen saturation was in the muscle that we were monitoring. And in this case, it was their right quad, their vastus lateralis. So we wanted to see just what their baseline was. So that's what this is here. So the reason why we do a typical calibration is to give them, where would they return after work? So what would the baseline be for recovery? And again, we're going to, as you go through, you're going to see where I'm going with all this. And then their ability to dive into those resources. So they, on go, this athlete sprinted as hard as they could. Each one of these ticks is a minute. So you see that this athlete sprinted as hard as they could. And the goal for this athlete, as I mentioned, is to get them to dive into those resources. So we don't have to get them to spend more time down there just to fatigue for the sake of fatigue, because there's a lot of other stuff this athlete has to do throughout the week. So if the goal is to dive into those resources, it makes more sense for us to try to continually dive into them instead of just diving and staying in there and blowing a lot of energy. So admittedly, in the past, we would just sprint for 30 seconds to a minute to try to get them to work as hard as they could. But we know now that, well, once you know better, it's important to use that information. So what we see here, this athlete diving into those resources here, And they spent a couple of seconds in there just to see if they could dive in anymore, and then they couldn't. So we seen them, the party's over, so it was time to rest. And from here, we can see that they had a pretty good return when it comes to them resting. And, so at rest, for context, the athlete was perfectly still on each of the intervals, as best as they could be. And we see that once the athlete rested, they returned past that baseline. And that's part of the training response that we're looking for. We're looking for them to super compensate, like overcompensate, and for that to eventually be their new normal. That's basically training in stress. So it's not just to be able to do something, it's to be able to do it repeatedly, especially in a sport like hockey. So we see the recovery here is above this line here, which is going to be their recovery baseline. So just, well, all intents and purposes, let's just call it 50%, as even though it's a bit less. And we can see that each time they did an interval, they recovered, and sometimes dramatically over. So they got to about 10% over where they started from. So important to see that when we see this compensation pattern happen, that the athlete, they're gonna kind of come back down to normal. And once they do, that's when we would start the interval again. We wouldn't wait for them just to get back up there to get back down, because they were not going to have enough gas to get back down. So as the other thing to note is we can see them get over there, but we can see it took the athlete longer and longer, and then really long for them to get, for that return to start to happen. And this is where guiding our training with an SMO2 monitor really makes sense for the athlete. And it's not just a given time where we're giving an athlete a minute or two or whatever the protocol is for rest after, say, a 30-second interval. It's having their physiology guide how long the interval is and how long the rest is, so we can get the most out of that athlete. So we can see that super compensation, so that overcompensation happened. But to me, something really cool that happens with this athlete, let's clear this up a bit so we can don't turn into a big pile of mess here, is each time they dive in, they did a great job of keeping it very similar each and every time. So number one, that tells me the athlete really, really did their best to try to dive into those resources. So we can see those lines don't really change much. So it doesn't take the athlete longer to get as deep as they can. They really dove into those resources pretty close to the same rate each and every interval. So they had 6 total intervals here. And they're able to get into those resources each time at the same rate. But what does change is their ability to recover. So we can see about here, no artist. So if we start getting through averages here, we can see it really start, a different picture starts to get painted here. Let me make this one a little bit more, let's call it a little more to what happened there. So we can see the first 3, they recovered about the same rate. And then it took them longer and longer to recover as kind of time went on. And even here, it took them, like that top baseline for it to return took dramatically longer. So we can see that it took them much longer to recover from one to the next. These 3 here were very similar. So the first 3, very similar in recovery in how long it took them to recover. And we can see that the last 2, especially the last one, was much different. So if this athlete would have just had the exact same amount of time of rest, we definitely wouldn't have been able to see the same performance. But what we've seen with this athlete, they're able to generate in and around 700 watts each time they're on the bike. So if we would have given them the same amount of time to rest, say for example here, so if we would have taken that same amount of time over time, they wouldn't have been able to produce the same results because they just didn't have the same, they just weren't recovered the same as they were. So their recovery here took way longer than it did here. We can take a quick peek and see that it's about twice as long. And now their work output was very, very similar in all those cases. So how we use SMO2 to guide us is really, I think, the fascinating part about being able to use this in training. And that is, we have the recovery baseline that I touched on. So let's just put that across here. So the recovery baseline, which they started, and we can see them recover over that line each and every time, right? So if we take that, I'll make it so it goes right across here. So we see that recovery baseline, that's where they originally started from, and we can see them recover past that each and every time. But now we kind of did this on purpose to paint the picture. So what we also see is their performance baseline would be where they could dive into those resources each time. So we see the first three. So this is interval 1, 2, 3. They were able to get down that far, but the next three, they never made it. And we did this on purpose to kind of paint the picture. So now, if we're solely using SMO2 to guide our training, we would see that they need to be able to recover, which this athlete did, but they also need to reach that performance baseline. So how deep they can get into that oxygen resource. And we can see the first three they did, the next three they did not. So typically when it comes to using SMO2 guided training, we would first three, great, they got into it. The next one, okay, you didn't do it, you got to try again. We would typically stop at this one, but we wanted to show the lengthy recovery and to kind of paint that recovery picture. So on a typical scenario, athlete wearing the SMO2 monitor, we would go 3. These are very valuable intervals. We would see that, again, they couldn't do it here. We would do it one more time. And again, they showed that they couldn't do it. Okay, awesome, party's over. So we would stop the interval training there. So instead of beating the athlete for another 4, 5, 6 even intervals, and them wasting those resources, we can just get them to be a lot more optimal in their training and train to not waste those resources, because again, you only have so much energy to give. So in terms of a team sport in particular, there's other things that athletes have to work on. So it's not just getting them on a bike and pounding them. Like, they have to worry about on ice or on court or on field. They have to lift. They have to worry about skill development. Sometimes there's one-on-one with skills coaches. Like, there's a lot that goes on that needs to be addressed when it comes to training. So to make sure that the athlete is only doing what's beneficial and not getting them to do just really busy work at the end of the day, I think it's really valuable to get everyone to understand that smashing an athlete isn't development, and it's really to their detriment. We're not getting more out of the athlete because we're doing more. We can see that the athlete is compensating to do that. So their recovery has to compensate. So if we'd only spend the same amount of time training here, we wouldn't get the same amount of wattage out of that athlete. And we seen that we could get 700 watts. Even on this last one is actually one of their best ones. So to really use the SMO2 monitors, not just in testing, but in training, and we can do this every time. We can do it every once in a while. So we know for sure this athlete should be doing 4 intervals and maybe 5, but 4 for sure. And that's where it ends. So they drive that wattage as hard as they can. And once they can't hang on to that wattage anymore, party's over for the application that we're looking for here. So I wanted to shed some light for you guys to show just how important that the baseline for recovery and performance really is, so we can paint that picture when it comes to conditioning development for athletes in the off season. So hope you guys got a lot out of this. If you have any questions on interval training or anything else on how we can guide that training, don't be afraid to shoot us a message or just hit us up in the comments down below. But that is it. Cannot wait to see you guys this summer. I am out.